Noonian Soong is best known for his pioneering work into the positronic brain-based androids that, as of the late 24th century, are still unmatched in their complexity and operational prowess. Hi, Rick here, and this video is on the history of the SOONG-Type androids, the most notable of which is, of course, the Starfleet officer, Data. Noonian Soong was a Federation citizen, born to a lineage of cyberneticists and continued their work into artificial intelligence and robotics. This work began back in 2154 with the apprehension of the geneticist Lt. Soong. This scientist was imprisoned for his work in recreating the augment experiments that produced a number of genetically engineered humans. He did this by stealing the preserved augment embryos from Cold Station 12 and raising them in secret until he was discovered in 2144. Even in incarceration, he continued to research and develop his genetic techniques, mapping out a number of alterations to the human genome that would remove diseases from augmented populations. However, the Federation's strict stance on genetic engineering stood, and his work was routinely confiscated. After an incident in 2154, where his augment children freed him and tried to start a war with the Klingon Empire and Starfleet, he eventually resigned himself to the realization that the adage of superior ability breeds superior ambition was true yet again, and stepped back from genetics. He spent the remainder of his life drawing up plans and schematics for androids, a work that his descendants would later continue. Jump forwards around 180 years and we have the activation of the first SOONG-Type androids. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however, as the issues of creating such a compact artificial intelligence would have been immense, and soon Soong had fallen behind on his claims. His work was eventually seen as a dead end, and he moved to Omicron Theta, an out-of-the-way colony world most notable for its use as a pit stop on shipping lanes. This was even done under an assumed identity, as he had been laughed out of his scientific circles. Here he married Juliana O'Donnell, and the two continued the work laid out generations earlier to create the first functional positronic brain. Their first creations were two androids that functioned well enough for a time, but both eventually completely stopped working. This hurt the couple who had begun to think of the creations as their children, but they persisted in their work, eventually constructing B4. B4 was the most advanced model yet, comparatively at least, but lacked much in terms of brain power. His physical shell was modelled on the appearance of Noonian Soong, but alabaster white with yellow eyes. The design of the body, its capabilities and so forth would remain relatively unchanged throughout the later models, though the mind would receive considerable upgrades. The android in its current state was aware of its surroundings and could follow simple instructions, but it could not process much beyond the simplest of interactions. It's easy to look at B4 and say that Soong failed, but consider everything that it was capable of. It had enough memory to contain several lifetimes worth of information, fine motor control, awareness enough to move unobstructed through its surroundings, and all this in the body the size of a human's. It's here we see the true goal of the SOONG-Type androids project. At this stage they could have gone another way with the designs and produced an android servant, one that didn't need much more advancement, but that wasn't what Soong had wanted when he set out on his work. The goal was to effectively create new life, artificial and cybernetic in nature, sure, but one that so closely resembled organic life that it could be accepted as a person. For this reason they continued their work into the early 2330s, and they'd drawn up plans for two more androids, Data and Lore. Lore was activated first, and while supporting the same frame as B4, was far more advanced. He had functional emotions and a powerful mind. Proud of their work, the Soongs routinely introduced Lore to the other colonists. However, they were perturbed by its near-human qualities combined with its obviously unhuman capabilities. In short, Soong dropped Lore into the uncanny valley, but it was a bit more than this too. Lore began to exhibit signs of emotional instability, and began to see itself as not just different, but superior to those around it, even its creator, manifesting in an almost spiteful behaviour. Once again, a Soong had repeated the mistakes of the past, albeit in a different field. Lore was soon deactivated, while Soong set about working on his brother, Data. Data had basically an identical mind to Lore's. However, numerous upgrades were removed, such as most of the subroutines pertaining to emotion. However, things like artistic creativity were left intact, and I'd argue that you need a certain amount of expression, even if it is subconscious, to explore that side of yourself. But I digress, and that's a topic for another video. Sometime prior to all of this, B4 was deactivated too and stored before Data's activation. Soong deactivated Lore, with the intent to repair his faulty mind after he had finished work on Data, but too late and unbeknownst to Soong, Lore had already sent a message to the crystalline entity, marked out the location of Omicron Theta to the planet-raising creature like a free buffet sign. Because, as we've established, Lore was turning into a bit of a dick. Work was completed on the more artificial-seeming Data, and it's likely that he was partially activated during his testing, as he has vague recollections of the lab. As part of a basis on which to build Data's knowledge, he had copies of the memories of the colony's inhabitants and logs added to his memory banks. Juliana Soong, however, had trouble shaking the notion that Data would turn out like Lore, and convinced Noonian to postpone Data's activation. Soon, however, the crystalline entity rocked up and began to devour all organic matter on the planet. Soong was forced to flee for his life, and abandoned his lab and all its inhabitants, including Data, Lore, and B4. He had fled with Juliana, who was comatose from the attack, while many of the colonists hid in his lab. The colony managed to send out a distress call, and the USS Tripoli had arrived on scene. The crystalline entity had either finished feeding and moved on, or was yet to arrive, as they reported a verdant planet though devoid of inhabitants. Away teams discovered the inactive Data but never located Soong's laboratory, where Lore remained offline and the colonists were holed up. Data was activated by the away team and returned to Starfleet for study, his positronic brain being the most advanced that Starfleet had ever encountered and seemingly of human design. The crystalline entity must have returned at some point, however, to finish what it began, as by the time Data revisits the planet, it has been completely swept clean of all life. Eventually, Soong wound up on Terralina 3, where he set up a new lab and continued to while away his years using the experiences with Lore to create a more stable improvement for Data, whose career he had been watching from afar. Arguably the pinnacle of Soong's work, however, was the creation of Juliana Soong. This android had a full emotional range, emotionally stable, but unlike Data and Lore, restricted to human-level capabilities. She did, however, possess a working circulatory system, sweat glands, and even a built-in aging program and deactivation date, making her mortal. Her neural net was a direct copy of Juliana's, who had her mind scanned prior to her death, having never woken from her coma. She even emitted false bio-readings that fluctuated according to her state, making detection as an android by anything short of disassembly impossible. Well, impossible for a human anyway. In fact, she was so human and unaware of her state that she divorced Soong when he became too involved in his work and remarried. The goal of the Soong project, as I mentioned, was not to simply create an android or the most advanced AI possible, it was to make an artificial person, to test what defined sentience and consciousness and see what such a person could achieve. This is best exemplified by Data's abilities and numerous design features that seem to go out of their way to make him appear human. He has a subroutine that controls the randomness of his blinking, and he both has a pulse and breathes. The pulse is from his own circulatory system that carries a conductive fluid through his frame, and the breathing is to intake air for cooling purposes. Cooling vents or some futuristic fluid could be a much better cooling agent, but Soong went out of his way to create an approximation of lungs. Data was also programmed with the ability to learn. After a built-in acclimatization period, he could effectively mimic and adapt any task he witnessed, which was aided by creativity afforded by the very nature of his positronic brain. He even grew hair and a beard if he allowed himself to, and his body could mimic the aging process. All of these additions to his functions are pointlessly complex and must have taken no small amount of time to create, diverting time and effort. This leads to one conclusion, one supported by its creator. that Data was designed to fit in with organic life, to bridge the gap of the artificial by appearing as natural as possible. Most impressively, he was built for potential. As his neural net adapted from experience and grew more complex, Soong built in a number of abilities that would unlock when certain milestones were reached. For example, after 31 years of near-continuous running, a shock rendered Data offline, during which he discovered he had unlocked the ability to dream for no other reason than to be given the experience. Soong also created an emotion chip for Data's mind that, when added to his matrix, would allow him to experience a full emotional range. The reason for the removal of his emotions in the first place was to allow him an objective basis on which to build an understanding of right and wrong behaviour, guided only by his experience and ethical subroutines, unclouded by emotion as Lore had been. With that achieved, he eventually concluded his development had reached an impasse without the emotional understanding provided by the chip. After some brief hurdles with controlling emotions, Data seemed to incorporate the chip well enough, but could deactivate and reactivate it at whim. There's more on Data that I'll save for a personnel file, but in 2367 he was granted the rights of a sentient being by the Federation after much deliberation and dancing around the issue. As for the other Soong-Type androids, well, B4 resides with Federation Science, likely the Daystrom Institute, after having all of Data's experiences imported into the unit, and in beta canon sources, Geordi LaForge continues to tinker with B4 until he's able to restore Data's matrix in B4's body, which does take several years to accomplish. Data objected to this as he saw it as destroying B4, not saving Data, but B4 allowed himself to be overwritten, taking the decision out of Data's hands. Lore 2 is currently disassembled and in the hands of Starfleet, with his attempts to usurp control of Hugh's independent Borg thwarted by his brother. Again, memory beta content says that Lore was still in the hands of the Enterprise E scientists, but the point remains that while Data lost his life in service to his captain and crew at the Battle of Basin Rift, both his memories and identical physical forms are preserved in the hands of Starfleet. What started out as the scrawlings of a convicted scientist eventually culminated in one of the most remarkable technologies that the Federation has ever produced. Through much trial and error, the positronic brain was perfected by giving it the ability to learn and grow, but tempering it with human experience. It remains to be seen where Soong's research will progress from here, with Data even attempting to recreate his father's work in the creation of Lull, as short-lived as she may have been. Work with the positronic brain is still ongoing. Soong, being decades ahead with his research, was a complete recluse and secretive. Experts like Geordi LaForge and Bruce Maddox are still working to unravel the extent of Soong's programming and robotics work. What do you think? Which of the Soong types would you argue is the most successful? I'd have to say that the recreation of Juliana meets the project's goals pretty well, though she was unaware of her status as an android, so could she really be considered such as being a bridge between the artificial and organic life? Certainly she's more successful than Lore, but even he was remarkable in his own way. Thanks for watching this video on the history of the Soong-Type androids. I am thinking of doing a video on Data himself, whether that's a personnel file or something else I'm not decided on yet, so stay tuned for that. And thanks again. And until next video, I've been Rick, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.